Chair. By way of introductory remarks, I want to say that I agree with many of the principles behind this bill. It's a bill that the Labour Party is generally supportive of, obviously, with our minority report in mind. I think all Kiwis should have some security in where they live. I think Kiwis are entitled to some certainty in their accommodation arrangements. They need to be able to put down roots. Their kids need to have stability in where they go to school, and where somebody lives has a direct relationship on the stability of a child's life and their schooling, their early childhood education and so forth. So giving people stability, even those who cannot afford the home ownership dream in their rental arrangements, I think is really important. People have the right to live peacefully in their homes, even if they rent those, with relatively minimal disruptions. They are also entitled to be treated with respect by their landlords. I've been very concerned in the last few days, as the media coverage has reported, around the way some tenants of state houses are being treated in the neighbourhood of Pomari, which is in my electorate. And I think that some of the issues that they are confronting have direct relevance to the debate on this residential tenancies amendment bill, because it would suggest that the government aren't living up to their own expectations and the things that they are talking about in this bill, they're not willing to live up to themselves when it comes to state house tenants, particularly those in Pomari. In the neighbourhood of Pomari, there are over 40 houses, State Housing New Zealand houses, that are empty. Over 30 of those houses have effectively been abandoned by Housing New Zealand, and they are not putting new tenants in them. They are, to some extent, uninhabitable. They have been badly run down. But unfortunately, by simply abandoning them, the Minister is making the problem so much worse, because he's basically abandoned that whole community. We've now actually got whole rows of empty houses that are prone to vandalism, to squatting in some cases, and simply leaving those houses there and saying, well, actually, no, this is an antisocial neighbourhood, which is what the Minister tried to argue this afternoon, actually makes the problem worse. Because if you've got a whole lot of empty houses in a neighbourhood, then actually that makes the problems worse. Who wants to go and live in a neighbourhood where a whole lot of houses immediately around them are going to be empty? Subject to vandalism, maybe squatting, various other things that go on when when you're effectively creating a ghost town. Actually, the government are exacerbating problems that may have existed before, and they are stereotyping an entire community based on the actions of a small number of people that are being dealt with in other ways. So I think it's absolutely shocking that the government have all but turned their back on an entire community in my electorate, punishing innocent people. Good families who are doing the best, who are trying to do the best by their kids, are being punished because the government are on this grand crusade to persecute a small number of people. And I think that whole community deserves to be treated with a little bit more respect than that. And I actually extended an open invitation to the Minister yesterday. I'm happy to re-extend that invitation today, that if he wants to come and meet the residents of Pomari, I would be happy to arrange that. I will go with him. I would happily show him around the neighbourhood. It's a community that I've spent quite a lot of time in. I can say that in Farmer Crescent and Pomari, I have knocked on every single door in that neighbourhood over the last few years. I know many of those residents very well, and I'm absolutely appalled at the stereotyping that the Minister has undertaken there to suggest that they are all antisocial, that they are all members of gangs, that they are all involved in criminal activity is absolutely disgusting. These people deserve to be treated with some respect, and they are not getting that respect from the government. And I think that's really disappointing when you consider some of the rhetoric that sits behind this bill that we're debating at the moment, clearly rhetoric that the government aren't willing to live up to themselves. These houses have been poorly maintained. Yes, they do need redevelopment. There's no argument to me about that. As a matter of fact, I think they've probably been neglected over several decades. I don't think the blame rests with the last Labour government. I don't think the blame rests with the national government that preceded it. I think just generally speaking, that community hasn't had the level of investment and maintenance of those state houses that it really should have had. I don't really want to go back over a debate over who's responsible for that. What I want to know is what's going to happen now. Who's actually going to deal with that situation now and give the residents of Pomari the type of attention, the type of neighbourhood that they can be proud to live in? Because all we're seeing at the moment is that far from dealing with this situation, the government are simply turning their backs and saying, no, actually, it's the tenants' fault. Those people are to blame for the situation they find themselves in. I simply don't think that that's an acceptable argument for the government to be putting forward. I think there's... Mr Chair.
Chris Hipkins.
Thank you very much, Mr Chair. I think that there is so much more that the government could do in this area. We cannot ignore the impact that tenancy arrangements by Housing New Zealand or others have on the surrounding community. For example, I've been a regular visitor to the Pōmaere Primary School, and having a whole lot of empty state houses in that neighbourhood has had a big impact on the Pōmaere Primary School, and they are struggling to cope with how to respond to that, quite understandably so. This is not just something that has an impact on individual families, it has an impact on whole communities. I've been really concerned to see the stereotyping of that community that's gone on. Yes, I absolutely accept that there have been some people in that community that have behaved inappropriately. I don't necessarily want to go into that in great detail at the moment, but I absolutely object to the idea that an entire community should be punished because of the actions of a few. We had the Minister say in the House this afternoon that it's not Housing New Zealand's policy to leave empty all of the state houses in an area where there may have been some evictions. But that's exactly what they're doing in Pōmaere. So the question that Moana Maki put to the Minister this afternoon, which he did not address, which he did not answer, was why are Pōmaere being treated differently to all of the other state housing neighbourhoods throughout the country? Why are Pōmaere being picked off and picked on by this government? Because the residents of Pōmaere were told before the last election that if they had maintenance problems with their state housing, that the national government was going to address those. Phil Heatley went up and down the country and said that he was shocked by the state of state houses in New Zealand and that he was going to do something about it. The residents of Pōmaere will be struggling to reconcile that with the fact that he has made massive cuts to the maintenance, acquisition and redevelopment budgets for Housing New Zealand in this year's budget. Because they were looking forward to Phil Heatley making good on the promise that he made them before the last election, a promise that he is now very keen to forget, I guess along with all of the other promises that the National Party had on their pledge card around tax cuts and so on. So I want to talk a little bit more about some of the other provisions in the bill, but I just want to restate that point, and I think that this is something that we shouldn't underestimate the impact of. Residents of rental properties, whether they are Housing New Zealand or otherwise, are entitled to be treated with respect by their landlords. And I would assert very strongly that the government, as the landlord of the people in Pōmaere, is not treating them with the respect they deserve. And I think the Minister should do something about that. I think there are opportunities there. There is a redevelopment plan on the books. He could put the money into the redevelopment plan and actually give those residents a neighbourhood that they can be truly proud of. Because, Mr Speaker, we have to deal with the reality that increasingly people are renting their homes rather than owning their own homes. And that's a problem. I'm moving on now from the issue of Pōmaere to talk a little bit about some of the issues around why residential tenancies are so much more important and becoming more and more important as more people find themselves tenants rather than homeowners. I did a little bit of research on this a few months ago and discovered that the cost of a person purchasing their own home prior to the Second World War was about the equivalent of about 3.5 years of their annual salary, of the average annual salary. After the war that went up a little bit. You can imagine that they were paying for the cost of a war up to about 5 years and then went back down to about 3.5 years at the time the baby boomers were purchasing their homes. Now it's about 10 years of an average salary for somebody to be able to purchase their own home. So that makes home ownership that much more of a dream for so many families, and it makes the arrangements around tenancy so much more important. So I think that that's something that we need to consider in this House, and that's the reason why some security in tenancy arrangements, some respect, ensuring that both landlord and tenant are treated with respect, mutual relationships of respect, making sure that those things are very clear in the law and that the law is up to date, Mr Chairman, I think is very, very important, because increasingly New Zealanders are going to be finding themselves in rental accommodation because they can't afford the home ownership dream. So, Mr Chair, I want to conclude my comments on this, these preliminary comments, and I look forward to the rest of the debate.